Imagine the vast open plains of America in the 1800s, where the air smelled of dust and grass, where the horizon seemed endless, and where the ground shook under the hooves of thousands of wild cattle. These weren't just animals. They were living engines of change. They fed armies, fueled economies, and sometimes sparked bloodshed. Without them, the story of America would be incomplete, stripped of some of its most powerful chapters. And yet, most people have no idea that there were 11 unique wild cattle species, each playing a critical role in shaping the nation we know today. The Texas Longhorn is not just a breed of cattle. It is a living relic of survival, determination, and grit that mirrors the very spirit of the American frontier. Its story begins centuries before the United States was even a dream, when Spanish explorers landed on the shores of the New World in the early 1500s. With them came small, hardy Iberian cattle, creatures bred to endure both harsh landscapes and scarce resources. They were released onto the untamed lands of what is now Mexico and the southern United States, where they began to adapt in extraordinary ways. Over generations, through exposure to blistering summers, freezing winters, and a landscape teeming with predators, they transformed into something unique, the Texas Longhorn. By the time American settlers began pushing westward in the 1800s, these animals were already thriving in the wild, scattered across the prairies in untamed herds. They had developed extraordinary endurance, able to travel long distances in search of water and forage. Their horns, which could span up to 7 feet from tip to tip, were not just a striking display. They were a weapon against predators and a tool for asserting dominance within the herd. Their lean, athletic build meant they could survive on little more than scrub grass when other breeds would starve. In the unforgiving frontier, that was the difference between life and death. When settlers and ranchers encountered the Longhorn, they immediately saw value. This was an animal that required minimal care, resisted many of the diseases that plagued other cattle, and could be driven for hundreds of miles without collapsing. The rise of the Longhorn coincided with the growing demand for beef in the eastern United States, where booming industrial cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia were hungry for meat. There was just one problem: railroads hadn't yet reached deep into Texas, where most of these cattle roamed. The solution became one of the most legendary chapters in American history: the cattle drive. Cowboys, often young, tough, and fearless, would round up thousands of longhorns and drive them along trails that stretched hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. The most famous of these was the Chisholm Trail, running from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. It was grueling work. Cowboys faced stampedes, river crossings, searing heat, bitter cold, and the constant threat of rustlers and hostile encounters. Yet the Longhorns proved their worth every step of the way, enduring conditions that would have killed softer breeds. They could travel 20 miles a day for weeks on end, losing minimal body condition, arriving at the railheads strong enough to command good prices. These drives were not just about commerce. They helped carve out the mythology of the American West. Without the Longhorn, the cowboy might have remained an obscure regional figure rather than an enduring symbol of freedom and rugged individualism. The sight of a vast herd of longhorns moving across the horizon, dust rising behind them, became an iconic image etched into the nation's memory. In those days, the cattle themselves were semi-wild. Even after being rounded up, they retained a fierce independence, a stubborn will to live that made them both challenging and thrilling to handle. Economically, the Longhorn transformed Texas. After the Civil War, the state was broke, its economy shattered. But it had one resource in abundance: millions of Longhorn cattle. Prices for a steer in Texas could be as low as $4, but in the northern markets, the same animal could sell for $40 or more. That price gap turned cattle into the lifeline of the post-war Texas economy. Ranchers grew wealthy, towns sprang up along the trails, and railroads expanded to capture the booming trade. The Longhorn became, quite literally, the engine that drove Texas out of poverty. But the Longhorn's reign would not last forever. As the cattle industry evolved, consumers in the East began demanding fatter, more marbled beef than the Longhorn's lean carcass could provide. Other breeds, like Herefords and Shorthorns, began to replace them in commercial herds. By the late 1800s, the once vast wild herds of Longhorns had dwindled to near extinction. Ironically, the very traits that made them perfect for the frontier, lean bodies, independent spirit, hardiness, were now seen as disadvantages in a changing marketplace. What saved them from disappearing entirely was a renewed appreciation for their historical and genetic value. Ranchers and historians recognized that the Longhorn was a living link to the birth of the cattle industry in America. Preservation efforts began in the early 20th century, with dedicated breeding programs aimed at protecting the breed's unique characteristics. Today, Texas Longhorns are no longer the economic powerhouse they once were, but they are cherished as symbols of resilience and heritage. They grace ranches and pastures across the country, not for their market value, but for the legacy they carry in their blood. The Longhorn's impact on American history runs deeper than economics or romance. These animals were part of a chain of events that connected cultures, economies, and landscapes. They bridged the gap between Spanish colonization and the American westward expansion. They fed Civil War veterans rebuilding their lives. They shaped the very image of the cowboy and the cattle trail, which in turn influenced art, literature, and even politics. Every horn, every scar on their hides, carries a story of survival in a land where only the toughest could endure. Even now, when one stands in the presence of a Texas Longhorn, there is an unmistakable sense of history. The curve of those horns, the wary intelligence in their eyes, the deliberate, unhurried way they move, all of it whispers of open skies, untamed landscapes, and a time when America was still finding its shape. They are not relics in the sense of being obsolete. Rather, they are living monuments to a chapter of human and animal partnership that built towns, fed armies, and forged legends. The Longhorn story is, in many ways, the story of the American frontier itself, wild, relentless, and unforgettable. Long before steel rails cut across the continent, before telegraph wires sang with the hum of human ambition, the American heartland was ruled by a presence so vast and powerful that it seemed eternal. The American bison, with its towering hump, massive head, and deep, rumbling grunt, moved in herds so large they could turn the earth into a living, moving sea. They were not just animals. They were the lifeblood of an entire way of life. For thousands of years, Native American nations thrived alongside them, shaping their societies, economies, and spiritual traditions around this great creature. Every part of the bison had a purpose. Its meat provided nourishment, its hide became shelter and clothing, its bones were shaped into tools, and even its sinew was used for bowstrings. To the tribes of the Great Plains, the bison was not merely a resource, it was a sacred gift. When settlers first pushed westward, they were stunned by the sheer abundance of these animals. Explorers wrote of herds so vast that they stretched from horizon to horizon, taking hours, even days, to pass. The sound of them was like distant thunder, a deep, constant rumble that carried across the open plains. For indigenous peoples, this abundance was more than physical wealth. It was security, stability, and a living connection to the land. The seasonal migration of bison shaped tribal movements, ceremonies, and trade. Entire cultures, from the Lakota to the Comanche, were built on a foundation that moved on four powerful legs. But as the United States expanded west, the bison's fate began to change. In the 19th century, waves of settlers, railroad companies, and commercial hunters saw the bison not as sacred, but as profit, and, in some cases, as a weapon of war. U.S. military leaders, fully aware of the bison's role in sustaining native life, encouraged mass slaughter as a way to force indigenous peoples onto reservations. Trains began running hunting excursions, where passengers would shoot bison from the windows for sport, their carcasses left to rot. Professional hunters killed them by the thousands, stripping only hides and tongues, which fetched high prices back east. By the 1880s, the great herds had been shattered. From an estimated 30 to 60 million bison before European settlement, their numbers fell to fewer than 1,000 in the wild. The prairies, once alive with their movement, fell silent. For native nations, the loss was catastrophic. It was not simply the disappearance of food, it was the destruction of a way of life, the tearing apart of traditions and knowledge passed down over generations. It was a deliberate erasure of cultural sovereignty, achieved not through battles alone, but through the calculated removal of the animal that had sustained them for centuries. Yet the bison's story did not end there. A few voices, both native and non-native, recognized that this was not just the loss of a species, it was the unraveling of an entire ecological system. Small groups of conservationists, ranchers, and tribal leaders began efforts to save the survivors. Some captured bison calves and raised them in protected herds, while others lobbied for laws to shield the remaining animals from hunters. By the early 20th century, Yellowstone National Park became a key refuge, harboring one of the last wild herds. Over time, the bison began to recover, though never to their former glory. Today, they number in the hundreds of thousands, many living on private ranches or managed conservation lands. Tribal nations have also led powerful restoration projects, returning bison to native lands not just as livestock, but as living relatives, symbols of cultural resilience and renewal. The reintroduction of bison has brought back more than an animal. It has reawakened stories, songs, and ceremonies that were once silenced. The bison's presence on the American landscape is still commanding. Standing before one, you feel its weight, not just in physical size but in history. Its shaggy fur tells of brutal winters endured. Its deep-set eyes seem to hold the memory of thundering migrations, of prairies stretching endlessly under a sky without fences. The animal carries, in its very being, the story of a nation's rise and the price that was paid for it. For the United States, the bison became a complex symbol. On one hand, it was a reminder of the boundless resources that had fueled westward expansion. On the other, it stood as a haunting testament to the consequences of greed and short-sightedness. It found its way into the national emblem, appearing on coins, stamps, and state flags, a strange irony, considering how close it came to extinction at human hands. In modern times, its image has been reclaimed not just as a symbol of the frontier, but as an emblem of conservation and restoration. There is a quiet power in watching a herd of bison graze in the distance today, knowing that they once dominated a continent and were nearly erased from it. They are living witnesses to a time when America's heartland was truly wild, when the land was ruled not by machines or fences, but by the rhythms of migration and survival. And while they may never again darken the plains in numbers that shake the earth, their story continues to remind us that history is not only written in human hands, it is also written in the hoofprints left behind. In the tangled swamps and pine flatwoods of early Florida, survival was never easy. The land was hot, humid, and filled with hazards: mosquitoes that carried disease, snakes that could kill with a single strike, and tangled thickets where panthers and black bears prowled. This was no open prairie like the West, but a dense, unpredictable wilderness. And yet, long before Florida was part of the United States, there was a breed of cattle here that not only endured the harsh environment but thrived in it. They were small, wiry, and quick, with a stubborn independence that matched the landscape itself. These were the Florida cracker cattle, descendants of the very first cows brought to the Americas by Spanish explorers in the early 1500s. When the Spanish arrived on Florida's shores, they brought with them Andalusian cattle, tough, compact animals that had survived centuries of grazing in the arid, rugged terrain of Spain. Once released into the wilds of Florida, these cattle faced new challenges: subtropical storms, swampy ground, relentless heat, and constant predation. Over generations, only the strongest and most adaptable survived. What emerged was a breed that could endure extremes, able to live off sparse forage, swim rivers when necessary, and navigate dense underbrush with surprising agility. They were not the heavy, slow-moving cattle of the open plains. They were quick-footed and alert, always ready to bolt at the first hint of danger. For centuries, these cattle roamed semi-wild, managed by Spanish settlers and later by Anglo-American pioneers known as crackers, a nickname that came from the sound of their long whips cracking through the air as they herded cattle. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Herding Florida cracker cattle was not like trailing docile beef breeds across a pasture. These animals were skittish, fiercely protective of their calves, and capable of vanishing into the thick palmetto scrub if not constantly watched. But their independence was also their strength. They needed little human intervention to survive. They could calve unassisted, fend off predators, and withstand diseases that killed other breeds. During the colonial period, Florida's cattle trade became a vital part of the region's economy. Beef and hides were shipped to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and to markets in Cuba. When the United States acquired Florida in 1821, the cattle industry continued to grow, feeding settlers, soldiers, and later, Confederate troops during the Civil War. In times of war and scarcity, Florida cracker cattle were a lifeline. They could be driven long distances through dense wilderness to supply food where it was most needed, and their small size made them easier to transport by boat or over rough terrain. But as railroads and modern ranching expanded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Florida cracker began to fall out of favor. Larger, meatier breeds like Herefords and Angus promised more beef per animal, and many ranchers began crossbreeding or replacing their herds entirely. The very traits that had made the cracker so valuable, its lean build, small frame, and fierce independence, were seen as disadvantages in a market that prized fattened carcasses and docile temperaments. Gradually, the once abundant herds dwindled, and the breed teetered on the edge of extinction. Yet the story of the Florida cracker cattle did not vanish completely. A handful of ranching families, many with deep roots stretching back generations, held on to small herds, valuing them not just for tradition, but for practical reasons. In the mosquito-filled wetlands and sandy pine barrens, these cattle still outperformed modern breeds in endurance and survival. They could thrive on marginal land that would starve heavier animals, and their natural resistance to parasites meant fewer losses in areas plagued by ticks and worms. These qualities caught the attention of historians, conservationists, and agricultural researchers, who began to recognize that this was more than just a relic of the past. It was a living link to the earliest days of ranching in America. By the late 20th century, efforts to preserve the breed were underway. The Florida Cracker Cattle Association was formed to protect pure bloodlines and encourage breeding programs. State parks and heritage farms began keeping small herds as living history exhibits, allowing visitors to see these cattle much as they would have appeared in the 1700s or 1800s. Their curved horns, varied coat colors, and alert, watchful expressions made them a striking reminder of Florida's frontier days. For many, seeing them wasn't just a glimpse of history. It was a realization that survival and adaptability often outweigh size and brute strength. Today, Florida cracker cattle are rare but valued, particularly by small-scale ranchers and those seeking sustainable, low-input livestock. They require minimal supplemental feeding, adapt well to hot and humid climates, and retain the ability to fend for themselves in ways that most commercial cattle have long since lost. They may never dominate beef markets, but their role as genetic reservoirs is increasingly important in a world where climate change and disease threats demand hardier animals. Their bloodlines carry centuries of survival skills, traits that could one day help secure the future of cattle ranching in challenging environments. When you stand in the presence of a Florida cracker cow, you don't see just another farm animal. You see the shadow of Spanish ships landing on a wild, untamed coast. You see the crack of a whip echoing through pine flatwoods as a mounted herdsman pushes a small but stubborn group of cattle toward a distant market. You see a breed that endured hurricanes, heat waves, swamps, and scarcity, not because it was pampered or protected, but because it was strong enough to face the world as it was. And in that endurance lies its quiet claim to history, a claim not written in books, but in the living, breathing form of a cattle breed that refused to disappear. In the dusty borderlands where the American Southwest meets northern Mexico, life has always demanded toughness. The land is dry, the sun unforgiving, and the vegetation sparse. Here, in a place where only the hardiest survive, a particular kind of cattle made its mark, a breed as agile as it was enduring, shaped by centuries of adaptation and human need. These were the Corriente cattle, descendants of the same Spanish stock that gave rise to the Texas Longhorn and Florida cracker, yet distinct in their size, temperament, and role in history. They were not the massive, slow-moving cattle that came to dominate commercial ranching. They were smaller, quicker, and far more nimble, making them indispensable in ways that went beyond meat and hides. The Corriente's story begins with the early Spanish settlements in Mexico. From the 1500s onward, ships from Europe carried cattle across the Atlantic, releasing them into the rugged landscapes of the New World. Over generations, the cattle that settled in the harsh deserts and thorny scrublands of northern Mexico developed into a breed uniquely suited to the environment. They became leaner and lighter-boned than their European ancestors, able to travel long distances in search of food and water. Their endurance made them a perfect match for the unforgiving terrain, while their alertness kept them alive in a region where predators were a constant threat. For centuries, the Corriente was the backbone of rural life in northern Mexico and the border territories. They were valued for more than their ability to survive. They played a cultural role as well. In ranching communities, these cattle became central to traditional horsemanship and cattle handling practices, laying the groundwork for what would later become the cowboy culture of the American West. The same nimbleness that allowed them to evade predators made them ideal for sport and training. Corriente cattle could turn quickly, stop on a dime, and test the skills of a horse and rider in ways heavier breeds could not. It was this agility that made them a fixture in early rodeo events, particularly roping and bulldogging competitions. Long before rodeo became a commercialized sport with grand arenas and prize money, it was a practical demonstration of skills that working cowhands needed every day. A rider who could rope or wrestle a quick-footed Corriente had proven his worth as a ranch hand. Even today, Corriente cattle remain a preferred choice for certain rodeo events because of their athletic build, quick reflexes, and natural resilience to the stress of handling. Yet their importance went beyond entertainment and skill building. In times of scarcity, when droughts withered pastures and other breeds weakened, Corrientes continued to provide meat and milk. They did not require lush grazing land. They could survive on thorny brush and sparse grass that would leave other cattle starving. Their small size, often weighing hundreds of pounds less than commercial beef breeds, meant they could move across difficult terrain without exhausting themselves. In a region where water could be scarce for months at a time, this resilience was not just a convenience, it was the difference between keeping a herd alive or watching it perish. As the cattle industry in the United States modernized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Corriente, like other traditional breeds, began to decline in numbers. Commercial ranching demanded larger, heavier cattle that produced more meat per animal, and smaller breeds were seen as economically inefficient. Many Corriente herds were crossbred or replaced entirely with larger beef breeds. But unlike some rare cattle that faded quietly into obscurity, the Corriente's survival was bolstered by its role in rodeo culture. Because they were still needed for roping events, team penning, and other competitions, pockets of pure Corriente cattle were preserved, often by families who valued them for their heritage as much as their utility. By the late 20th century, the breed was recognized as a distinct and historically important type of cattle, and conservation efforts began to ensure its survival. Ranchers who specialized in raising Corriente cattle took pride in maintaining their pure bloodlines, preserving traits that had been honed over centuries of desert life. These traits were increasingly appreciated in modern ranching, where the costs of feed and water made hardy, low-maintenance animals more appealing. In certain parts of the Southwest, Corriente cattle are once again recognized not just as a nod to the past, but as a practical choice for sustainable ranching in dry climates. Standing in front of a Corriente cow today, you see an animal built for movement and survival. They are smaller than most people expect, with sleek bodies and a sharp, alert gaze that seems to constantly scan their surroundings. Their horns curve in elegant arcs, sometimes long and sweeping, sometimes short and sharp, each shape the result of generations of natural selection. Their coats come in a variety of colors, solid, speckled, or spotted, reflecting the genetic diversity that helped them adapt to changing environments. They move with a lightness uncommon in cattle, their steps quick and sure-footed, as if they are always ready to spring into motion. To watch them in a rodeo setting is to see the living embodiment of agility. They twist and turn with sudden bursts of speed, challenging even the most skilled riders. But to watch them in the quiet of an open pasture is to witness their other defining quality, self-reliance. They graze without fuss, picking through scrub and cactus pads, finding nutrition where other cattle would find only obstacles. This is the essence of the Corriente's place in history. They were never the biggest or the most profitable in the eyes of industrial ranching, but they were the cattle that endured when conditions were harsh, that trained generations of horsemen, and that carried forward the traditions of ranching culture on both sides of the border. The Texas Longhorn is not merely a breed of cattle. It is a living emblem of resilience, adaptability, and the pioneering spirit that carved the American frontier. With its distinctive sweeping horns that can stretch over 7 feet from tip to tip, this remarkable animal embodies both beauty and survival in a way that few species can. Its story is deeply intertwined with the rise of the cattle industry, the settlement of the West, and the forging of a rugged American identity. In the vast, untamed landscapes of the 18th and 19th centuries, where survival often depended on adaptability, the Texas Longhorn thrived. It could withstand searing heat, bone-chilling cold, long stretches without water, and pastures too sparse for other breeds. This toughness wasn't an accident. It was the result of centuries of evolution, blending Spanish cattle brought by early explorers with the challenges of the North American wilderness. The result was an animal perfectly adapted to its environment, and in many ways, to the destiny of the American West itself. The Longhorn's value went far beyond its physical hardiness. For settlers and ranchers, it became the foundation of economic opportunity. During the post-Civil War years, when beef was in high demand in the industrializing North, the Longhorn was the key to transforming open grasslands into sources of immense wealth. Cowboys would drive enormous herds from Texas to railheads in Kansas, sometimes covering more than 1,000 miles over several months. These cattle drives, immortalized in American folklore, were grueling journeys, filled with dangers from storms, stampedes, and hostile encounters. Yet, the Longhorn's endurance made it possible for the cattle trade to flourish, feeding not just a market but also a growing nation's expansion. Without this breed, the cattle economy might never have achieved the scale and influence it did in shaping America's agricultural and economic foundations. Beyond the economics, the Longhorn also left an imprint on American culture. Its image became synonymous with the cowboy, the trail, and the spirit of the West. Paintings, stories, and songs celebrated its role as a creature of freedom, roaming the plains with the same untamed energy that settlers believed defined the American character. Even today, in a world far removed from the realities of 19th-century cattle drives, the Texas Longhorn remains an icon, its silhouette gracing everything from university mascots to ranch logos. It stands as a reminder that history isn't just made by people, but also by the animals that journeyed alongside them, enduring the same hardships and forging the same path toward a shared destiny. The legacy of the Texas Longhorn is one of endurance and transformation. It took root in a wild and unpredictable land, survived conditions that would have destroyed lesser breeds, and helped to feed, clothe, and inspire a nation in the making. Its story is not frozen in the past. Ranchers still raise longhorns today, valuing them not only for their hardiness but for their historical and cultural significance. In them, we see the living memory of the trails, the open plains, and the gritty determination that pushed America westward. The Texas Longhorn, in every sweep of its horns and every steady stride across the grasslands, carries the untold stories of a time when survival and success depended on grit, adaptability, and a partnership between man and beast that shaped the very fabric of American history. In the end, when we trace the hoofprints of these wild cattle across the pages of American history, we realize they were far more than animals. They were partners in the nation's growth, symbols of resilience and living, bridges between the untamed wilderness and the civilization that rose from it. Each breed carried with it a story of migration, survival, and adaptation, shaping the land as much as the land shaped them. And though their roles have changed with time, the legacy of these creatures still pulses through the open ranges, the ranches, and the cultural memory of America. They remind us that history is not only written by human hands, but also carved into the soil by the strong, tireless hooves of those who ran before us. Their story is our story, wild, enduring, and forever part of the American spirit.